Welcome to the Embodiment Podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with specialists from around the world. I'm your host for today, Mark Walsh. On the show today, Judith Blackstone. So Judith is the founder of the Realization Process and has books and audios and various other things under that name, some of which I've actually heard and like rather a lot. So I've been looking forward to having Judith on for a while. It's taken us a while and super happy you're here, Judith. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
How did you get interested in the body? Tell us a little bit about the beginning of your journey here.
Okay. Well, the beginning of my journey really starts when I'm around 9 years old, when I began my career as a professional dancer, and danced until I was 25, when a pretty bad injury stopped that career in its tracks. And of course, by then I thought I was really on course. I'd been doing it for 15 years, so I was quite distressed. To lose that was really almost like losing everything for me. So that set me out on a healing journey. I went to body workers, all sorts of therapists, healers, and medical doctors. Finally, finding no real help, I lay on the floor of my dance studio, where I was living at the time in Lower Manhattan, and just kind of opened myself up to whatever I might be able to do for myself. And I began to experience all kinds of interesting things. I had had surgery on my spine as part of the trying to remedy this injury. And they had, surgery had fused me in an off-center position. Really awful, when I had been, quite centered and agile all of my young life. So now I was fused in this off-center position. So I'm lying on the floor and I begin to feel waves of energy coming up from the ground and bringing me into alignment, which I just found amazing. All I'm doing is lying there. And so it's as if the action of nature, of gravity, can bring me into alignment. And from there, I just took off on a whole inner exploration. I had dance students coming to my studio a few times a week. That was how I was earning a living. And I began to teach them these very subtle kind of attunements that I was exploring for my own healing. That was many years ago. And little by little, it grew into this series of practices that's called the Realization Process.
Wonderful. And, when you meet people and they say, okay, how would you describe the realization process? The horrible question we all dread, I think, when around our own work. What is it you say to them?
Okay. When I was first starting out, I was told that I needed an elevator pitch.
Right.
And actually, it's quite difficult work to describe in a few words, because it encompasses the body, embodiment, even movement, psychological healing, and opening to what I'm now referring to as non-dual realization. I've sort of aligned myself with the non-dual teachers, contemporary spiritual teachers, for a number of reasons, but mostly because the realization process is primarily a way of uncovering very subtle consciousness that we can actually experience. Some will say that it experiences itself, that we can experience pervading our own body and at the same time pervading our environment. So that's a very interesting experience. It means that we feel even that we're made of consciousness, and this is deep contact with our individual being. Later on, I'll talk about what that implies. But we can experience our whole kind of the ground, what feels like the ground of our being everywhere in our body, and at the same time, as we're experiencing this cohesive wholeness, a sense of internal unity and volume, we experience oneness between our own individual being and the environment. The same subtle consciousness that we can experience pervading everywhere in our own body. At the same time, we can experience it pervading all of the people, the objects, the trees, the animals around us in our environment.
So this is, if I can jump in there a little bit, so this phrase non-dual may be new to some listeners. I know some areas it's widespread, but so as I'm hearing it, it's the realization that instead of being me and everything else, it's a realization of everything or oneness. So that self and other disappears and is just left with oneness rather than the duality.
Except that we don't disappear. I mean, that's the I feel even the contribution of the realization process. It's often taught as a disappearing of the individual, and it gets to be quite a disembodied concept, non-duality in that way.
Yeah.
But in fact, because this very subtle consciousness is pervading our own body at the same time as it pervades our environment, it's not only oneness, but it's our individual wholeness. So we don't disappear. In fact, we become more present, more accessible to ourselves than before. But yes, I'm using non-duality in the sense of oneness. And there are many non-dual teachers now. It's kind of a trending contemporary facet of the spiritual world at this point, non-duality. But it's taught in many different ways, as it has been for thousands of years. The term non-duality has been used to mean a variety of different experiences. But this particular type of non-duality is actual uncovering of what feels like the unified ground of our being.
Yeah, so I want to ask what ground of being means, because I've heard lots of American teachers say that, and I've never understood it at all. But first, other teachers in the field, so it's people like Adyashanti, or who else would be sort of associated?
Adyashanti, Peter Fenner, John Prendergast. There's really many. In part, I've aligned myself with them because I developed this work outside of lineage, really out of my own healing. And I wanted to be to align myself with some group of people to be part of a community. And so they seem to be the closest to what I'm teaching. And I also admire most of the non-dual teachers for not presenting themselves as gurus.
Right. Okay, so it's outside of the normal, because I guess kind of normal, Hindu or Buddhist traditions may have a sense of Satori or some kind of non-dual awakening, but it's embedded within a particular lineage. There may be a kind of guru thing attached to it. And it seems like this non-dual teacher tradition is very Western in some ways and breaking free from some of that.
Yes, and I think it's important, and I also think it's one of the positive signs of our time that we understand that people are basically equal, and that certain human beings shouldn't be exalted and certainly not worshipped in that way. Although, as a skillful means, Guru Yoga is I'm sure a very helpful tradition for many people. But for myself, of course, I don't want to be seen in that way at all. And so I've kind of joined this group of non-dual teachers who also are presenting this work and very often integrating it with psychotherapeutic techniques. So it is more of a contemporary sort of lineage.
And things have a way. There seems to be a way of in the West of those traditions get in trouble, isn't there, and ends up in difficult situations. So I'll make a point of not washing your feet today, Judith.
Thank you.
Just out of respect there. So no, I like that approach very much. And this ground of being, that I think I first heard Ken Wilber talk about this, and I went, what on earth does that mean? I'm fairly ignorant in these matters, so excuse me. Can I?
Yeah, one of the important things for me in teaching this kind of work is really attempting not to make metaphysical assertions, right? So I don't know if there is a fundamental dimension of consciousness. I know that we can experience it. And I know that experience seems to resemble descriptions of an experience that exists both in the Hindu and the Buddhist literature from 1,000 years ago, at least. So I'm trying to talk in terms of experience. Now, ground of being is also, in the way I use it, just an experience. I don't know if there is a grounded being. I don't know if there is a being. I don't know if we're being dreamt by some creature, in outer space. I have no idea of the metaphysical underpinning of our lives. But we can uncover this very subtle, and it's unified, and it's unbreakable, because it's consciousness. So very, very healing for those of us, especially who've been through quite a lot of trauma in our early lives, that this aspect of ourselves that we can uncover and actually experience hasn't been injured. It's just seems to be sitting there waiting for us to uncover it. Now, I'm talking about uncovering it, and here we do, get right into that interface with metaphysics, because it does feel like something that emerges as we reach a particular degree of openness, rather than creating it, right? Rather than imagining it or constructing it. So here we're going, what I feel is a step further from the last whole generation of philosophy, at least in the West, of constructivists, of people who claim that there's nothing except what we create with our minds. Now, we can find like concepts in Buddhism to that as well, but there's also a whole wing of Buddhism that says that we do have, in fact, Buddha nature, that when we let go of our concepts to some extent, and in my terms, when we make a deep enough contact inwardly with ourselves, we do uncover what does feel like an essential aspect of ourselves. It comes with the impact of authenticity. So here again, this is just a subjective statement, right? But that's how it feels. It feels like, oh, finally, the masks are gone. I can just be. It feels like finally this is who I am. And it even feels, when we see the world emerging and pervaded by this fundamental consciousness, this kind of luminous, clear space, it feels like, oh, that's really the tree. That's the tree in its treeness. Now, it's still being filtered through my mind, right? We know that I can only experience the tree as my mind senses convey it to me, right? Convey it to me. But still, we can get a clearer and clearer image of that tree. And when we know ourselves as this consciousness pervading everywhere, yes, it feels like finally I'm really experiencing the tree.
Mm. Can you say a little bit more about the role of the body in this work? In that some of the non-dual work I've come across has been very talky or wordy or abstract, and I know your work is very sort of step-by-step practical. What I experienced of it in the Sounds True course that I did a couple of times is I'd love to hear a bit more about the role of the body in all this, in case people are getting lost in the philosophy.
This is entirely a body-centered practice. I do come from a dance background, and the work emerged from me healing my body and realizing that I needed to contact myself on a very subtle level of my body in order to heal. So what I discovered in that process is that everywhere that we can actually inhabit the body, live within the body, we are open to our environment. So here's an interesting thing, living within the body. You might ask, well, if we don't live within our body, where do we live? Well, in fact, most of us live in front of ourselves, above ourselves, not quite in contact internally everywhere in our body. But in fact, to the extent that it's mentioned in the spiritual traditions, it's considered quite a high achievement to have this real body-mind or self-body or consciousness-body integration. But that's what embodiment is in this work. It's actually living within, present within the internal space of the body. Something quite different than being aware of the body, right? In our vernacular, embodiment is often meant to mean, well, we're aware of the body, which of course is a major step in the right direction than not being aware of the body. But this is still another step to not just being aware of the body, but actually living within it, so that our consciousness, our being, our presence everywhere in the body.
I love this distinction, and it's only became meaningful to me a year or two ago. And after years of meditating sort of on the body, all of a sudden I was meditating as the body.
Yes.
And then you gave me some more language for this when I came across your stuff. And I tried to convey this to some of my students. I'm still struggling to convey that distinction between mindfulness and embodiment. And it got even more complicated recently because I brought this up with a Buddhist friend of mine, Martin Elwood, who's a Buddhist teacher in the south of France. And he said, well, actually, if you look at the original Buddhist texts, there's translations of the Pali, which are things like experiencing the body as the body, or a womb-like quality of body, of being in the body, and like being in the womb of your own body is this sort of translation from the Pali. And I was like, wow, okay, maybe they were much closer to it than maybe modern mindfulness and this sort of distance of aware as. And then there's a way it kind of came together, and it's like, oh, that's different than being aware of my body. But I'd love to hear you say more about that difference, because I feel like I'm pretty clumsy in articulating it.
It's, in fact, very difficult to articulate to people who haven't experienced it. And so that's why in every book I write and even in every interview I give, there's generally a certain point where I include practices, because to be in the body rather than aware of it is something that's unmistakable once you experience it. But to try to explain it verbally, it's certainly very, very difficult. I know, because I've written about 6 books now, so I've spent the last 30 years of my life trying to articulate it. But again, I always include the practices so that people can get at least a taste of it, and then they go, oh, yes, that really is different than being aware of the body. It's very interesting. I had never heard that about early Buddhism, talking about the body being in the womb of the body. That's beautiful. It's rarely mentioned in spiritual practice. Now, some Buddhist lineages do talk about advanced realization being the attainment of a rainbow body, so that the body does take on all of the qualities of consciousness itself. But it's considered very far out, like the last boomy, very, very far out attainment. And here it's really not. It's something that we can all do. We can all, just through simple focused practice, feel that we're living within the body, and that at the same time, inward contact with ourselves is openness and responsiveness to the environment. For example, if we live within the chest, right? So that means actually that we're inhabiting that internal volume of the chest. If we do that, we find that we're experiencing the present moment, both inside our chest and outside in the room or the outside at the same time. And an added thing is that we find we're emotionally then more fluid, more deeply and fluidly responsive. So all of our human capacities, as we make this inward contact with ourselves, become freer and more clear and more vivid.
I think it's very useful to have some kind of a map of internal embodiment, whether someone's using a chakra system or, Bonnie Bainbridge-Cohen's kind of body systems kind of map. And I like that yours was quite straightforward. The one I saw of yours was you're working with 3 centers. So it was like belly, heart, chest, and the center of the head. Am I remembering that right?
You're remembering that right, but that's the core of the body, which is not quite the same as inhabiting the internal volume of the body, right? So it is an important component of the work that we get to access and live within a very subtle channel, experienced. Again, we don't know if it exists, but a very subtle channel that runs through the whole vertical torso, neck, and head, right, of ourselves. And it's called Sushumna in Hindu yoga. It's called the central channel in Tibetan Buddhism. So many people have been able to experience and chart this very subtle channel in the core, vertical core of the body. When we get to that, that is part of our entranceway into all-pervasive fundamental consciousness, pervading both our body and the environment. So we do need to get to that in order to get to this very subtle ground. So the realization process approaches this in both these ways, both by inhabiting the whole internal volume of the body with all its particular qualities and accessing that very subtle channel.
Yeah, I used to be quite skeptical about sort of subtle energy type models. And then I just decided to be kind of agnostic about it, saying rather than saying this does exist or it doesn't exist in a physical way, I said, you know what, it's about experience. It's a way of working. And I did some subtle, some central channel stuff under the Reggie Ray's tradition. And I was like, wow, okay, this is definitely having an impact, if nothing else. And that's really the important thing here. Is not if there's some kind of piezoelectrical energy that hasn't been properly mapped yet by science, but simply is this useful as a technique?
Yeah, certainly that's where I'm coming from. I think little by little it is being scientifically studied. My husband is studying it through EEG equipment right now, currently, and so I think the science of it is important as it emerges, but it's not vital for our realization. For our realization, what's important is just that there are ways to access this experience and the extreme satisfaction that's derived from that experience.
So, I mean, I'm hearing you say there's two basic methods you're working with. So one is tuning into this central channel or various centers within that. And another one is the experience, experiencing the whole body, but as the body rather than in abstraction and removed from.
Yes, the whole body as consciousness.
And as consciousness. So what do you mean by that? I mean, you feel free to offer an experience or to talk more as you prefer.
Right. So not only do we know the feet as our feet, but we're living inside of them, and that contact is conscious. Right? We're making conscious contact with the internal space of our feet. So instead of our consciousness just being in our head, it's now in our feet as well. It's now in our legs as well. And that's how we get to that undivided consciousness that we experience everywhere in the body, as if we were made of consciousness. So it's a shift in identity, right? It's a shift from knowing ourselves as muscle and nervous system and blood, even the shift from knowing ourselves as energy currents, vibrations, streaming, pulsing, to knowing ourselves as this pervasive stillness, a very vibrant stillness everywhere in our body, which feels like who we are. So it's not something separate from us. It feels like who we are. That's why in the Hindu system, it's often called self with a capital S.
It's interesting. There's this kind of seeming contradiction between the sort of Buddhist system that says no self, you're nothing, you don't exist, and the Hindu system, which is saying, okay, it's self with a capital S. And I'm wondering if you've got a take on how, because my sense is they're both right, but I'd love to get your take on how that's possible.
My sense is that Buddhism is not a metaphysical system. Buddha himself is said to have said that anyone who asks a metaphysical question is like someone who's been shot with an arrow, inquiring, well, what kind of wood do you think it is? Who made the arrow? Rather than just taking that arrow out and healing the wound. They're interested in the origin of suffering and dealing with that suffering in Buddhism. So I take that no self teaching as what we call skillful means, right? So instead of I am Judith and I am a teacher and I was born here and I do this, we have this experience, this non-verbal experience, which we can say is no self because it's not that abstract or autobiographical self, but there is this underlying experience. So we could call it self, we can call it no self. I don't think it matters, but there it is. Now there's two wings of Buddhism. Since we have a bit of time today, I'll just briefly tell you what they are. There's the Rangtong and the Shentong, and the Tibetan Buddhists very nicely and carefully lay this out for us. So there's a whole wing of Buddhism that says there's not even a ground, that there's only the changing flux of experience that becomes clearer and clearer with enlightenment. And then there are the Shentong people who say that yes, there is a ground, there's a Buddha nature, there's that one, whatever you want to call it, who's observing that flux, right? So those Shentang people come very, very close to the Hindu notion. And, the Hindus get to it, the Advaita non-dual Hindus get to it in the same way by saying, I am not my emotions, I'm not my thoughts, I'm not my feelings. So what am I? I'm what's left after all that, right?
Yeah.
But there is something left.
The neti, like, okay, what's there? And as language kind of fails us a little bit at this point as well, doesn't it? I think that's something where we sometimes poetry or mysticism kind of trying to explain it clearly doesn't make sense unless people have had experiences that match.
Yes. Yeah.
Quick interruption to tell you about my book, Embodiment. Creatively named, hey? Actually, Embodiment Moving Beyond Mindfulness. You can find this online at theembodimentbook.com. That's theembodimentbook.com. So this book is an introduction to the whole field. If you like these interviews, you'll probably love this book. Funny stuff, poems, personal stories from my life, illustrating what embodiment is all about, and loads for professionals in the field too. Top teaching tips, language tips, that kind of thing. Yeah, a real condensation of everything I've learned about embodiment, basically. So you can get pre-orders at Amazon.com, and if you just put in Embodiment Moving Beyond Mindfulness, that's the name of the book, or go to theembodimentbook.com. On there, you'll see quotes from various teachers, a bunch of fun illustrations, and you can also get the first chapter completely free online at theembodimentbook.com. Enjoy, and back to the interview. This word inhabitation I quite like. I think I got it from Philip Shepherd. So sort of rather than being aware of the body, there's an inhabitation. But I hear you actually going one step further than that.
Well, we begin by inhabiting the body. I mean, that's the beginning of the main realization practice. And it's a wonderful feeling. It feels almost like the foot fits inside the foot, if you can experience that. So we really become unified within ourselves. So we're living right there within the whole body. And then when we do that, we attune again to the space outside of the body. And then we can feel that that space, that inhabiting the body that has made an internal spaciousness, is the same as the space outside. So without losing that internal spaciousness, we live as a one ground, again, I'll use that word, one ground of consciousness inside and outside the body at the same time.
Mm. Yeah, sometimes I had this image of sort of putting on like tights or yoga pants, of, as you say, sort of fitting within oneself. If you imagine very sort of snug clothes that one fits into. Yeah. And what's the advantage of this then? Sorry to be so brutally pragmatic, but kind of why bother? Why, it feels good, it's useful. Like, what's for the sake of what here?
What, inhabiting or knowing oneself as fundamental consciousness?
Knowing oneself as fundamental consciousness.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
it's a brutal question, I know, but why bother?
Yeah, why bother? I mean, really, there's no reason to bother until one becomes uncomfortable with being not quite in contact with oneself. And then at that point, one has to bother in a way. One has to keep stripping away. And that comes to us either as an emergency, as it did in my life, a crisis, or it simply comes as a dawning awareness that we're not quite in sync with ourselves, with other people, with the world, and something must be done. Now, of course, traditionally, why bother was so that we could end the cycle of rebirth. That's certainly not why I do it. I do it because of the extreme happiness of feeling spontaneous, feeling who I really am, feeling greater and greater access to my ability to love and to understand and to experience life. So really the goal in terms of these more contemporary methods, such as mine, is authenticity and happiness.
I like you brought authenticity in there too. Something that's this sense of this is often I have this nagging feeling that the sort of me that's running the show on a day-to-day basis isn't really my best effort, isn't really the best. Well, it's my best effort, but it's not the truest, deepest version of me. Like I was a bit late for this call because my masseuse went over, I mentioned, and I kind of had this voice in my head as I was running up the stairs, all these excuses, and and I went, oh, is this really me? And then another experience would be something like when I've stepped out of that, fear disappears, right? It's like, well, yeah. I'm less separate from the world, and being separate is terrifying because it's me versus everything. And yes. As opposed to me as everything, that's far less scary, if nothing else. Anxiety isn't there in the same way, right? And also in terms of quality of relationships, as well as my own happiness, it's much easier to get on with my wife if I'm like, well, that's my own face staring back at me, from a 29-year-old Ukrainian point of view. It's a very different relationship I'm going to have with her rather than you over there, me trying to get what I can from you kind of thing.
That's absolutely right. And not just that, but in terms of relationship, there's a depth of contact that occurs, at least when both people know themselves as this primary aspect of themselves. There's a depth of contact. Here again is a word, contact, very hard to articulate to somebody else who's just not experienced it. But I think for most people have experienced it, at least in a fleeting way, right? That we're really in touch with the other person. There's that moment of meeting where, Buber described it as I-thou moments, where you're really meeting. It's not even that you're the same person, but that the essence of that person's essence of me really connecting. When you know yourself as fundamental consciousness, it's an ongoing transformation of how you are. That depth of contact with people you love and with everyone is ongoing. It's always there. So relationships are very much enriched by this kind of realization.
I'm trying to give a sense of this to someone else. I was saying, the experience you might have during great sex of oneness with the other. Imagine having that without the exciting orgasm, or the blinding lights, with the guy in the Quickie Mart down the road when you're buying your bottle of water.
That's right.
Like that's sort of not really imaginable. Normally that's met with laughter and giggles when I say that, but I'm like, no, really, like actually that.
Yes, actually that. It's that basic kinship, but again, actual kinship. Like, oh yes, I know you. Right, I'm only going to be with you for this 2 minutes while you ring up my groceries, but we know each other.
Right. So a sense of knowing, and also ethics comes very easily there, right? As well, like because in the same way as I wouldn't punch myself in the nose, if my sense of identification is much broader, it just gets much easier to be good to people.
Well, you would certainly think so. I mean, we've seen that disproved,
What goes wrong in those cases then? Because I think there have been genuine masters that have had genuine, realization experiences that do really hurt people. So what goes wrong there? Because I find that hard in the passing moments I have of this as a state experience rather than a sustained trait. I can't imagine that. So what happens there?
I can't imagine it either. And sometimes people do ask me that, but I have no more answer for it than anyone else. I do think that people are extremely complex. So you take someone like let's say Trungpa Rinpoche, who I met many years ago. I was never a student, but I met him, and he was extraordinary. And I had just a few phenomenal experiences with him from a distance. I mean, he was amazing. And I can really attest to that. And yet, obviously, parts of him were not well. You know,
he was an alcoholic, right? I mean, and abused.
He was an alcoholic. He was in pain.
Yeah.
He was in pain, and part of that pain was obviously something to do with women. So that's been the best way I've been able to describe it to myself. I've had a number of teachers go off the rails in that way, and it's obvious that the parts of them were just unwell. And then the fact, of course, that they're in a position where they can abuse that power easily.
Yeah, the systemic stuff and the systems they're in, I think, is as much a part of it as the shadow as well, isn't it? Is not seeing these things as the same thing, isn't it? Maybe you could say a little bit more about this. It's sort of a taboo subject, talking about enlightenment, talking about realization, waking up, in some circles anyway. And there's a way, particularly in place cultures like British culture, Australian culture, or Dutch culture, where don't be too big for your boots is a big thing as well. So if I said to someone I'd had a realization, even experience a glimpse of something like this, there's a certain amount of that's quite countercultural to talk about. So, what are good terms to talk about this in, which aren't arrogant or esoteric, that are just like, this is an experience people can have, it's an experience you can have more of, and I understand it's something you can stabilize.
Yeah, luckily the people that I really need to describe this to are already, okay, we're awakening, and that's okay, So I haven't really had to describe it very often to people who have no way to encompass that. But it is deeper contact with ourselves and the world around us. That's, I think, the simplest terms. When you're teaching this, really when you're teaching anything, when you're sitting there in front of a group of people and they're all focused on you, right? Or as a therapist, when you're the one listening and they're the one pouring their hearts out, you are in a position that can be abused, right? There is a power imbalance there, even if you haven't, set yourself up as a guru. So you do need to take great care as to how people are holding you, how they're regarding you, and how you're responding to that.
How was it for you to set up your own system? Because it's kind of the realization process, registered trademark and books and courses, and obviously there's pros and cons to that. How was it to sort of set it up as a thing in itself?
Yeah, it happened very gradually. I've been teaching this, I don't know, a long time. I mean, say maybe 45 years, a long time anyway. That it took various steps of just emerging as a method in itself. That was a gradual emergence. But for a long time, I had 10 students, sometimes 3 students, and so it grew very slowly. So, and that was a good thing in a way, although it was frustrating at times. But it was good in the sense that I got used to every next little step. And now I'm at a point where I'm quite glad that it has become, to some extent, a thing outside of me.
Right. It's not called the Judith Blackstone process. And this, I'm looking at your website here, and there's, various teachers around the place, and, this list of senior teachers and list of teachers by location and places like that. It's realizationprocess.org, by the way, if anyone wants. Realization spelled the American way with a Z. So realizationprocess.org, if anyone wants to look on there. Okay, so let's talk a bit more about trauma. You mentioned this briefly earlier. I know you've got a book out on trauma, and this is a fascinating subject to me. So as I understand it, it's kind of the realization that your small self is the hurt self, the damaged self, and you are not that. Is that the kind of approach to trauma you're coming from here? Or please say more.
So I try to avoid that kind of language of having a small self and a real self and a higher self and so forth, because really there's just us, just the one being. In the word trauma and the way I'm using it, it's been used in a number of different ways. The way I'm using it is any experience that's been too overwhelming, especially for when we're children and easily overwhelmed, too overwhelming, too confusing or painful for us to fully experience, for us to really take in. And so we've protected ourselves by constricting the instrument of our experience, our body, right? So we've kept out the loud, angry voices by just a little bit constricting our hearing. Not enough that we're going to be deaf, although that has been known to happen, but just a little bit, just so the world is just a little bit quieter, right? We also constrict ourselves to hold back our own responses to life, again, especially as children, but it can be also teenagers or even as adults if the stakes are high enough. We hold back any sort of response, such as tears or anger, that might be met with parental disapproval or punishment or danger. For example, if a child gets angry and expresses anger, the parent is liable to get even angrier at the child. And of course, the parent's anger is a lot more powerful than the child's anger. So that child will learn after the first experience like that to hold back their anger. Still very interesting to me, although I've been talking about this for a number of years, that we cannot control any aspect of our experience except by tightening our body. Right? We can't hold back tears except by tightening the anatomy of our tears. Right? We can't hold back anger. If anyone listening here wants to experiment with this, you can take a moment, maybe conjure a little sadness. You'll probably feel it in your chest, but wherever you feel it, and then try to control it. You'll find that you can't squelch that sadness except by tightening the part of your body where you're experiencing it. So in that way, we grow up with a series of these holding patterns. And this is just simply the human condition. It's not, we can't call it pathology because it's too universal, it's too common. So part of the work in the realization process is to release these constrictions, these protective constrictions in our body. We've also constricted ourselves to mirror our parents' pattern and where they live in themselves, right?
Yeah, cultural restrictions too, I'd say. But
yes.
You said something really profound there. I just kind of want to underline in red that trauma is where we don't experience something fully. And the second thing I really want to underline to take away here is you cannot have that without a constriction. You need that physical constriction in order to feel less. So it's like, okay, I can't handle that. I can't reduce that. The only way I can reduce that is to reduce my feeling of that. And that's the contraction. And this is a very broad definition of trauma, right? It's not just PTSD. And I find this very helpful.
Yes, good. So everywhere that we're constricted, we have no contact with ourselves. We're not living in that part of ourselves. So most of us have kind of design where, well, we're living in, we have enough access to ourselves that we can still live, productive lives. We're fine. But if we decide that we want to realize ourselves as fundamental consciousness, we want to know ourselves more deeply, then we do get to the point where we need to release these holding patterns little by little. And again, it's a gradual process. It's an ideal to have no constrictions whatsoever in ourselves. But we can little by little let go of them. And because we've constricted our senses, we've constricted our chest, our ability to respond emotionally, we've restricted ourselves sexually, we've restricted our power, our sense of power, when we've been overpowered as children particularly. Because we've done that, when we start to release it, we have an amazing experience of the world becoming more vivid, sounds becoming more vivid, feeling empowered, feeling emotionally fluid and responsive, feeling sexually responsive, much more pleasure available to us. So even releasing just a little bit of those holding patterns really brings us back to a richer experience of our lives.
Wonderful. Love it. It's really actually very simple in some ways, your work, and it is profound at the same time. I listened to the audio series. I listened to If It Sounds True like a few times over. I did some of the exercises with the different centers, and there's some moving exercises too, aren't there? Sort of moving backwards and forwards and a few things. I kind of really thought it was pretty good action. I'd recommend it to people, but I also went, I'd probably need to get to a retreat, and I couldn't find a retreat in Europe. But it looks like you do some stuff. You've got some courses online courses, a whole bunch of books out. I've got the sort of old, I think it's a self-published kind of little purple one on the shelf somewhere. That was one of your early ones. But anything
it's published by Paragon House now.
Paragon House, is it? Great.
Yeah.
Anything you want to say about sort of how to learn this stuff? Like, what are some ways to access this?
Well, it is best, of course, to do it with a teacher. And there are people doing workshops in Europe now. Cindy Cunningham's doing one in Edinburgh. If you look on the website, realizationprocess.org, there are teachers teaching throughout Europe and even and Canada, certainly, and probably in Asia as well. My workshops are mostly in Woodstock, New York, where I live, in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and in California, and in Seattle, Whidbey Island near Seattle. And those are all listed. It's probably best, if you can, to get to a workshop or private work with a teacher. But all the exercises are in the books. They're in that 6 CD audio series from Sounds True. So if you're someone who prefers to work on their own, then you can certainly do that.
Great. I've actually got your website in front of me here, and I'll be no doubt looking through that after this call to see if there's anything I can make. Normally, too many juicy people on this podcast, and I've always got, I want to go at all their stuff. Pesky things like earn a living and eat and sleep. Okay, so are there any subjects that we haven't touched upon that you feel like, you know what, this is really core? Do you want to share it? We have time for an experience if you want to share an experience with listeners.
Well, I can do just that very short exercise for people if they're interested to experience the difference between being aware of the body and in the body. And that I can do in just a few minutes. Should I do that? Okay, here we go. So if you're interested in this, rest your hands in your lap and take a moment to become aware of your hands. In becoming aware of your hands, you may notice how warm or cool they are, or how tense or relaxed they are. All right, so you're aware of your hands. And now enter into your hands. Let yourself experience that you're actually present and living within the internal space of your hands. If you can feel that difference, you can even take a moment to experience that you're in your whole body in that same way, right? In your feet, in your legs, in your whole torso. Yeah, in the actual practice, we go much more slowly, part by part, but you might just get a taste of what it's like to be inside the internal space of your whole body, your arms and hands, your neck, your head, and your brain. Now, if you want, you can go a little bit further and find the space outside your body, the space in the room, right? Not with your eyes, but just finding it, that space outside your body. And if you can, let yourself feel that the space inside your body and outside your body is the same continuous space. You're in your body, but you're permeable in that way. Space inside and outside is the same. If your eyes are closed, open them. See if you can still feel that, right? The space inside your body, you're in your whole body. Sometimes it's harder with the eyes open because the world appears. You'll have that internal depth of yourself sitting in your body. And the space inside and outside your body is the same continuous space. And one last thing, if you're doing fine with that, you might be able to experience that the space that pervades your body pervades your whole environment, right? Your computer screen, your phone, right? Trees outside the window, without leaving your body at all, without moving at all from within your body. So we're not finding the environment. We're finding this, what feels like space, I'm going to call it space, pervading you and everything else. Okay. That's probably enough for a little taste. Yeah.
Judith, thank you. I feel like I've had a warm bath in myself in the middle of a busy, quite stressful day. So super appreciated.
Thank you,
Mom. Okay, so let's end this in the normal way. Realizationprocess.org is the website, and there seems to be links there to books and online events and real life events and various things. Any other places people should be looking for your stuff?
No, that's the place to go for it, because both the teachers and my itinerary is on there.
Great. I've heard a couple of good podcasts with you as well on it was Brooke Thomas's show. Sadly over now, but that was a good one. And another one I heard, I think it wasn't Buddhist Geeks, it was Embodied Philosophy podcast. There's another good, if people want more podcasts with you, there's a couple of other good ones I recommend. Yeah. And do you have a closing message about the body, Judith?
Well, this little exercise that we just did, if it appealed to you, you can continue to practice that wherever you are. Just being in your body, feeling that the space that pervades you. I'm calling it space, but it's actually this consciousness, very subtle consciousness, pervades you and everything else.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Some ways to get more, to give back, and to get more involved now. So the biggest request I have would be to share the podcast with your friends, people that you think would really enjoy it. Email it to them, put it on your social media, tell them about it, old school. Really appreciate that. Equally, if you want to support us financially, you can go to Patreon. That's patreon.com/embodiment podcast and give us $1 an episode. And I'd say they're well worth $1. So that's less than £1 if you're in UK-ish. So yeah, please go there. On the embodiedfacilitator.com website is where this is hosted. Most people I think listen to for iTunes. iTunes, we'd certainly appreciate a review. The way iTunes works means that a review means more people will find it. iTunes regards it as more important for searches. So even a couple of sentences review really does help as a little thank you to us. And if you want to go to embodiedfacilitator.com, you can see the actual, links to the sites. There's comments on there. The Facebook group tends to be where people discuss things. So if you go to put in the Embodiment Podcast into Facebook, there's a page which is relatively quiet and a group which does have some discussion on. So I will reply to things personally there. So also on embodiedfacilitator.com website, there's all sorts of freebies there. There's videos, there's free ebooks, there's ebooks you can buy. And of course, there's our newsletter list. If you want to stay in touch and learn about things like the Embodied Facilitator course and our next Embodied Yoga Principles teacher training, then go to that website and you'll see a little pop-up and you can get the newsletter through there. Okay, so I think they're the main ones. Tell your friends, pay us some money on Patreon, give us a review on iTunes, send us your email if you want to be on the newsletter list, and get involved on the Facebook there. Bit long. Pick whatever you like that works for you. Until next time, welcome home to the body.